got quiet. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. My name is Randy Hollerith, and I'm the Dean of Washington National Cathedral. And we are so glad to have you here tonight for this wonderful conversation with David Rubenstein. I'm very grateful to David for the time he's giving us tonight. He's getting on a plane after this to head to LA for meetings tomorrow. So we're so thankful for you making time to do this. And after our conversation, I hope if you're able, you'll stick around for a little bit because David is going to take some time to sign some books after our conversation. There'll be a couple of tables in the back of the cathedral. To all of you who are here this evening and to those of you joining us online, please know how thrilled we are to always welcome you to this cathedral. We are first and foremost a house of prayer for all people. And you are always welcome amongst us. For any of the programming or any of the things that we're doing here at the cathedral, I hope you will consider this cathedral your cathedral. Now it's my privilege to introduce to you Sharon Percy Rockefeller. Sharon is well known to many of you. She's a leading figure in our nation's capital who has, among other things, served since 1989 as president and CEO of WETA, Washington's flagship public television station and radio stations. Sharon is a longtime friend of this cathedral, and she's a current member of our Dean's Council, and she has kindly agreed to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight. Please join me in welcoming Sharon Rockefeller.
Thank you very much, friends, schoolmates, parents of schoolmates. I go back a long way with the cathedral. My half-sister and brother, the Percy kids, were students here. So I'm going to divulge a secret tonight that I've never divulged. I'm utterly, utterly, utterly grateful to the National Cathedral, first of all, for getting my children out of West Virginia public schools, where they went for 5, 6, 7 years. And I shouldn't have done it, but I didn't care because I cared that much that they get into good schools. Before the election, November 1984, I came up and made an appointment secretly with the principals of Beauvoir and NCS and St. Albans and said, hypothetically, if there were to be an election and if one were to win from West Virginia, hypothetically, if you had children between the ages of 4 and 14, 1 for each of these schools and 2 for the boys' schools, hypothetically, how would you treat that person on Wednesday, the day after the Tuesday election? Would you take a call from her? They said, we don't do hypotheticals, but yes, we'll keep this in mind if they're qualified. I said, I don't know about that, but we'll try. So honestly, my allegiance to the cathedral started with the fact that Justin went to Beauvoir when he was 4, Valerie went to NCS when she was, I think, in 4th grade, 5th grade. The 2 boys went to St. Albans when they were about, 4th and 7th grade, something like that. And I was home again. I've served on the chapter, and I made sure we lived 12 minutes from the cathedral if I had 4 drop-offs morning and evening. Even more gratefully now, I want to thank, because I've had 2 different cancers over the last 15 years and an advanced cancer during the last 2 years, Johns Hopkins Medicine is a wonderful place, if and when you need it. The National Institutes of Health is an excellent place, if and when you need it. But the Reverend Canon Jan Cope and Dean Randy Hollerith are the best possible people to make sure that 2 years from whenever you will be standing erect, perfectly able to deliver your remarks because of their prayers. Over and over, through their visits, phone calls, prayers, and vigilance, they kept me going, and I love them for it. I really do. So it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce tonight's program, a conversation between two remarkable leaders. In just 3 short years, Dean Randy Hollerith has brought transformative guidance to the National Cathedral. He has a highly talented lay and clergy team, and I've seen 35 years of lay and clergy teams, including Jan Cope, and this is the best, no question about it. Dean Hollerith is steering a new strategic path for the cathedral as a center for worship, inquiry, reconciliation, and outreach. Doing so requires that all of us be good stewards of this extraordinarily special and beautiful place. I never get beyond the beauty. And that we be stewards of the spiritual needs of the cathedral community, both near and far, around the corner and very far away. Doing so also requires what Randy terms radical welcome and hospitality. I'm for it. Open spirits and robust outreach programs. So tonight, Dean Hollerith will be in conversation with my incomparable, and there's no other word, but incomparable friend, David Rubenstein. Most of you have heard of David and know him as an innovative businessman and as an advocate for history, for improved health, for education, for the arts and culture, especially for Washington. He's put Washington on the map as a meaningful place. He defines the term patriotic philanthropist. He uses his intellectual skills and relentless energy to support wonderful institutions, including the National Cathedral, the National Gallery, where David and I know each other, and many, many, many more dozens of organizations around this area and in New York and elsewhere. In his second career, he's decided to be an interviewer extraordinaire. On Friday nights, on WIDA, after Washington Week at 8, we air the David Rubenstein Show called Peer-to-Peer Conversations. There are no peers to David Rubenstein, but he's being modest. We repeat the show on Sundays at 6:30, in case you miss it. In this program, David engages world leaders from business and public life in fascinating conversations. Last night was Jeff Immelt. He has the ability to draw out not only how they achieved their success in many different dimensions, but also the humanity, the humor, the grit, and the character they have to be true leaders. David's interviews emanate from many venues, such as the Economic Club, where I see many of you, Museum of Modern Art, the New York Historical Society, the Library of Congress, and on and on. And you will be seeing all of those on WIDA in the coming months. In his new, really great book, The American Story, Conversations with Master Historians, David delves into our shared past, guided by the top historians of our times. Through my sources, I received an unauthorized, advanced copy of I'll never tell you, David, of the book, and I devoured it. One Saturday afternoon and one Sunday afternoon, joyfully. It's a pleasure. Then to set a good example, I ordered about 100 to send to my family, to send to my friends, to send to the WETA Board of Trustees, and all the other people who should be reading David's book. For anyone else interested in the lessons of history, it is an absolute must-read. Thank you for coming to the Cathedral tonight, and please join me in welcoming Dean Randy Hollerith and David Rubenstein. Thank you.
Sharon, thank you for those kind and overly generous words, and I hope if when I return here in a horizontal fashion someday, you might deliver those same remarks. Sharon has done a spectacular job for more than a quarter century leading the WETA, and I hope all of you who are public television fans appreciate all the work and time that Sharon has put into making that public television station so successful here. So thank you for that. Now, among other things she's done, of course, she's now the chair of the National Gallery of Art, and I have the pleasure of serving with her there, and hope all of you will come to visit the National Gallery of Art when you have a chance. We have some spectacular exhibitions on now. Some of you don't know that Sharon and I are really related, or sort of related, and let me explain. When my ancestors came over to Ellis Island, my family's name was actually Rockefeller. And when they got to Ellis Island, they said, you know, we want to make sure people know we're Jewish, so could you get rid of the Rockefeller name and give us a nice Jewish name? So my real name was Rockefeller, but they changed it to Rubenstein. When I was growing up in Baltimore, not with the Rockefeller name, but with the Rubenstein name, I must be honest and say I never thought I'd be standing here. I never thought that somebody whose last name was Rubenstein would be speaking at the National Cathedral, but I'm very honored to be here. And let me just tell you a little bit about how I got to the book that we're going to talk about a little bit later. So I grew up in Baltimore. My last name, as you know, is Rubenstein, and when your last name is something like that, you think the father might be a doctor or a lawyer, but there are blue-collar Jews who are not well-educated, and my father was one of them. He dropped out of high school to go into World War II, came back at the age of 20. He married my mother, who dropped out of high school to marry him at 17. So I was born more than 9 months later. I was their only child, and I grew up in Baltimore. Baltimore was the most rigidly segregated city in the United States by religion, because the United States Supreme Court had outlawed the restrictive covenant practice of saying you can't sell a home to somebody who's black or Jewish, but Baltimore never quite got the word. So even though it was outlawed by the Supreme Court in 1948, in Baltimore they still had this practice. So all the people who were Jewish had to live in one little area. And so I was about 13 before I realized everybody in the world isn't Jewish. It turns out that not that many people are Jewish, but everybody I knew was Jewish until I was about 13. Then I went to a large public high school, and I realized it wasn't quite all Jewish. When I was in the 6th grade, my teacher said to me, watch this speech tomorrow. President Kennedy's going to be inaugurated. And so I watched it, January the 20th, 1961. Some of you may remember this. And it was in black and white television that I had then, a small one. And it was the greatest inaugural address, I think, of the 20th century. It inspired people like me to want to go into public service. Remember the signature line, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And that was intended to be the main signature line of the speech. John Kennedy always wanted to have a signature line, as Churchill had done in his speeches. And so my teacher went over that with my classmates and me the next day, and it just said to myself, this is what I want to do. I want to go back and serve my country in some way. In those days, there were no hedge funds, no private equity funds, no tech startups, all these great things that people can do with their lives, like private equity. They didn't have that then. So all I knew was I'd go be a lawyer or a doctor, and I didn't really do well in science, so I was going to be a lawyer. So I would serve my country as a lawyer. And I got a scholarship to go to Duke University. It was not a basketball scholarship. I was the only person in Duke's history to get cut from an intramural basketball team with only 4 other people on the team. So I did okay there, and then I applied to law school. And I didn't have a lot of money, but I got a full scholarship to go to a law school, the University of Chicago. They sent a letter saying, send in your $50 and reserve your place. Then the next day I got another letter saying, send in your $50, reserve your law school dorm room. Well, I didn't actually have a lot of extra $50 around, so I sent in $50 to reserve my dorm room. When I showed up to register for the law school, they said, you didn't send your $50. I said, I sent the $50 in for the dorm room. Why would I need a dorm room? I'm not going to law school. They said, well, it's a different part of the university, and your logic just doesn't apply. So I didn't know whether to jump out of the window or cry or what. My legal career was about to be over, so they didn't want somebody, I think, to jump out of the window, so they came back and said, okay, we'll give you the scholarship. So I've been so grateful. I've given them now $65 million in scholarship money to repay it. So, but I wanted to practice law, and I went to practice law with the man who helped write that speech for John Kennedy. His name was Ted Sorensen, the most gifted speechwriter any president's ever had. And I went to work for him, and he quickly realized I wasn't a good lawyer, and my clients quickly realized I wasn't a good lawyer. So as a public service, Ted Sorensen got me a job outside of practicing law, and the job was to be chief counsel for the man he said would be the next president of the United States, and I was going to go work in the White House just as he had done. So I went to work as chief counsel for Senator Birch Bayh. You may remember in 1976 he didn't get elected, and he, in fact, 30 days after I joined his staff, he dropped out. So some of you may have had an experience where your career seems like it's over. Here I was, 25 years old, my career seemed over. And then I got a call out of the blue from somebody I didn't know, say, would you like to interview for somebody else who's running for president? And I said, who? And they said, Jimmy Carter. I said, that's the peanut farmer from Georgia, right? They said, yes. Let me tell you something, he's never going to be president. But I had nothing else to do, so I got the interview, and actually I got the job. And I went down to Georgia, and I worked in the campaign, and when I went down there, Jimmy Carter was 33 points ahead of Gerald Ford. And after I was done, Carter won by 1 point. So Carter said to me, like, what was your contribution really? I was doing pretty well before you carpetbaggers came down here. But as we all know, White House staffs are filled with people who work in campaigns, and so at 27 years old, I became the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor to the President of the United States. Now, I wasn't qualified for that job, but I didn't think anybody was qualified in the administration, so I didn't really stand out. One of my jobs was to fight inflation. I got it to 19%, which hasn't been, no one's done that since. And we had some problems, and I said to President Carter, don't worry about the hostage takeover. Those hostages will be released in a couple days. So my advice wasn't so great, but people came to me all the time and said, you're a bright young man. If you want a job, call me. And I said, why would I do that? I want to be in the second Carter administration. And I said, we're going to have one for sure, because I know we're going to run against somebody we can beat. And people said, who is that? Well, I prayed to dear God that it would be Ronald Reagan. I said, nobody that old could possibly get out of bed in the morning and run for president. He's 69 years old. I'm now 70. So 70 now seems like a teenager to me, but in those days when I was 31, it seemed like an old man. Be careful what you wish for. So we got Ronald Reagan, and we got clobbered. So I called all the people who told me how great I was and give me a job, and none of them ever called me back because I was out of power, and if you're out of power in Washington, you're a dead man. As Harry Truman said, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. So finally, I couldn't get a job practicing law, and I didn't want to tell my mother that her only child was unemployable, so I kept saying I had so many offers I didn't know which one to take. Well, this went on from January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August. My mother said, David, just take one job. So finally, I begged somebody to let me start at the beginning. I started up practicing law again, and once again, very quickly, the client said, you really don't know how to practice law. And my clients, they told the partners, hey, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. So I had to do something else. And then I decided to start an investment firm in Washington. And it was the first investment firm of its type here. And where's Marlene Malik? Where's Marlene? Her husband was there in the beginning. And where's Marcia Carlucci? Where's Marcia? And Marcia's husband came very shortly thereafter, finished as Secretary of Defense under Ronald Reagan. We started a firm. It was called Carlyle, and we made it work reasonably well. We made a lot of mistakes, but we did things well enough so that it grew and became one of the largest in the world. And so around my mid-50s, Forbes magazine wrote an article saying how my net worth was very, very high. And I didn't want to tell my family how high it was, so I kept saying to my family, that's wrong, it's not, you can't believe, it's fake news, don't believe what you read. So in the end, though, I realized that when you have a lot of money, you can do four things with it, really. You can spend a lot of money and buy a lot of art and other things, but you can't spend everything you have. You can just husband it all and then bury it with it in the pyramids like the ancient pharaohs did, but probably it won't be staying with you in the pyramids very long as grave robbers show up. So then you can give it to your children, and giving each of your children $1 billion doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a better citizen, I would say. And in fact, nobody's ever won a Nobel Prize after they inherited $1 billion. So if you want your kids to be productive, maybe don't give them so much money. So in the end, you give it away to good causes, and most people either do it while they're alive or upon their death. Bill Gates came to see me and he said, why don't you give it away, mostly while you're alive? And so I began the process of doing that. And as all of you probably know, giving away money sounds easy, but it's complicated. There's lots of different things you can do well and do poorly. And I began the process of devoting a lot of my life to giving my money away, and also to joining organizations, so to join the Kennedy Center or the Smithsonian and try to provide some leadership to those organizations. And then what happened that led to this book really is sort of this. Most of the philanthropy that most people do, and I would remind people, philanthropy is an ancient Greek word that really means loving humanity. It doesn't mean rich people writing checks. It's been bastardized, but it really means helping other people with your time, your energy, and ideas. And the most valuable thing you can give is your time. You can always make more money if you're inclined to do so, but you can't make more time. And so when you give your time, you're giving something that's very, very precious. And so I decided what I would try to do is not only give my time, but give some of my resources as well. And I did that, like most of the people who are fortunate in my situation, to schools that were good to me, that gave me scholarships, or to institutions in the city I live in, or hospitals, or medical research and so forth. And actually, the bulk of my philanthropy goes to those things. But I stumbled into one thing that led to what's now been called patriotic philanthropy. And that's basically this. The Magna Carta was for sale. I went up to see it. They told me it was going to be sold probably the next day and would probably leave the country. And I just decided that one of the 17 copies of the Magna Carta should stay in the United States because it was the inspiration for the Declaration of Independence. And so I did buy it and essentially gave it to the National Archives. And then I got in the habit of buying other historic documents. And then I got in the habit of helping to fix certain buildings. When the Washington Monument had its earthquake damage, it needed some help, and I decided I would help them, and then with other similar things, but the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, Monticello, Montpelier, and so forth. So I thought, what's the reason to do this, and why is it important? Well, we don't know as much about history as we used to. We don't teach history as much as we used to, and as a result, you find things like this. 3/4 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. 1/3 of Americans cannot even name one branch of government. 10% of college graduates think that Judge Judy is a member of the United States Supreme Court, which is not yet the case. And recently, a test was done where it shows this. If you're a naturalized citizen in this country, you have to pass 6 out of 10 questions out of 100 potential questions, 6 out of 10. 91% of the people pass that basic civics and history course. The same test was given to natural-born citizens, native-born citizens in the United States, and out of 49 out of 50 states, a majority of the citizens failed. So our basic citizens aren't knowing much about history. So I said, what could be better than teaching the people who actually are making the laws about history, about our laws, something about history. Now, so therefore, I came up with the idea of trying to educate members of Congress, not that they're not perfectly educated already, but a little bit more about history. And so I started this program where I would interview a great historian, Doris Kearns Goodwin or Ron Chernow or the equivalent, in front of members of Congress. And we do it once a month at the Library of Congress, which is neutral territory. I ask the Democrats and Republicans to sit together with each other so they can actually know each other a little bit and be civil. And I ask people from the House to sit with people from the Senate. And we get 250 to 300 members and their guests coming every time because they actually like to have a civil discourse about history, and they learn a fair bit about it. And so the book that I've put together is a book that is really, I've done about 50 of these interviews, and I had the space in this book to have 16 of them. And 16 of them are the most famous historians and their story, and my little summary of them. And I'll just tell you one before I sit down about one story. As the chairman of the Smithsonian, I've gotten to know the chancellor of the Smithsonian. His name is John Roberts. The Chief Justice serves as the chancellor. And so I spent time with him, and I said, Mr. Chief Justice, members of the Congress, their office is only a couple hundred yards from you, but they don't really know you that well. Can I interview you in front of members of Congress as part of this program at the Library of Congress? He said, okay. So I did, And at the beginning, I said to him, Mr. Chief Justice, did you always want to be Chief Justice of the United States when you were little? He said, no, I had no interest in that. Well, did you want to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court? No, I had no interest in that. Well, did you want to be a judge? No, I didn't want to be a judge. Well, did you want to be a lawyer? No, I didn't want to be a lawyer either. Well, what did you want to be? I only wanted to be a historian. That's all I cared about. I loved American history. And my father said, John, there's no money in being a historian. You'll write books, nobody will read them, you'll starve to death, how will you support a family? And little John said, that's all I care about, I want to be a historian. So John went off to Harvard and he majored in history. He came back from spring break his sophomore year, got off at the airport in Boston, and got in a cab and said to the cab driver, take me to Cambridge. Cab driver said, are you a student at Harvard? Yes, I am. What are you majoring in? I'm majoring in history. And the cab driver said, well, when I was a student at Harvard, that's what I majored in also. So John Roberts went to law school, and the rest is history, as they say. Okay?
David, thank you so much. That was wonderful. And Sharon, thank you for your wonderful introduction tonight. It really is a pleasure to be with you. And I have to say that I really enjoyed your book a great deal. And it did exactly what you hoped it would do, for me at least, in that I had read several of the biographies that were mentioned in the book, but it's also led me to add a couple of more to my nightstand. Those chunks, those chapters are wonderful chunks that just lead you to wanting more. So thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you very much. And I didn't say in the beginning of the book, but your support would probably indicate that if you read this book, you're likely to get to heaven more quickly. Is that right?
Exactly.
Right?
We have indulgences we can talk about later on. Yeah.
Right.
And I've been a big fan of yours. I love the Bloomberg show, but I've been a member of the Economics Club since I arrived back here in 2016. But I have to say, it's a little intimidating for me to interview the consummate interviewer. So I imagine there's some folks sitting out there right now who are looking at their watch, wondering how long it will take you to flip the tables on me.
Yeah, but you have the advantage that God is guiding what you're doing. I don't usually have that advantage, so it's a big advantage, so I think you shouldn't worry.
Yes, that's right. We're hoping for divine guidance for both of us tonight, exactly. So, as someone who's been so successful in business and done such an incredible job with the Carlyle Group, and I imagine you're rather busy with the Carlyle Group, how did your passion or interest in interviewing and this kind of career, how did this come about?
Okay, well, let me tell you what happened. Like many things in life that are interesting, they happen by serendipity and not by planning. I didn't plan to buy the Magna Carta, it happened quickly. Didn't plan to fix the Washington Monument, it just happened when the earthquake damage occurred. So what actually happened was, at Carlyle, to attract speakers to our big conferences, I would bring in former presidents of the United States and former secretaries of state and former secretaries of this or that or other prominent people, and ask them to make a speech. And typically in that business, you pay them a fee, and the fee could be anywhere from $100,000 to $400,000. That's why Jim Baker calls it white-collar crime. But so you get paid a lot of money for things that you can say pretty readily. And anyway, I was bringing these people in, and I realized, sometimes people weren't such great speakers, even though we're paying a big fee, and people were kind of falling asleep. So I decided I would interview them, and I said to their speaking agent, can I interview these people instead of letting them make a speech? And they said, is the fee the same? I said, yes. Then they said, no problem. So I started interviewing them, and I made people, laugh a little bit. I made Ben Bernanke look funny and things like that. It was not easy to do. And so then what happened was Vernon Jordan called me up, said, I want to see you. Now, Vernon Jordan has this great voice, and when Vernon Jordan speaks, it's not unlike the voice of God. Yeah. You respond. So Vernon had me come to his office in New York, and he said, lock the door. You're not leaving until you agree to do what I want. What is that? I want you to succeed me as the president of the Economic Club of Washington. I said, well, okay, but I don't even know what the Economic Club of Washington is. What is it? He told me it's about 100 people in Washington. They gather quarterly. Your only job is to get a speaker come in, a business person, let them speak, then you get questions from the members, read the questions on the cards, and that's it. I said, okay, I'll do that. So the same phenomenon. People started I got speakers, but they weren't that good. They're boring. So I decided, and then the questions from the members were worse. And then, so I would pretend I was reading questions from the members, but I was making them up as I was going along just to make it funnier. So after a while, I said, all right, I'm going to go to the same thing. I'm going to go to the interview format. And that happened about 11 years ago. And then Bloomberg came along, and they said, we've seen these. Why don't you do a TV show? And I said, okay. And then I said, what are you going to call it? They said, the David Rubenstein Show. And they said they were going to call it the David Rubenstein Show. And I said, I don't think a long ethnic name like that is going to work. And Mike Bloomberg said, no, it'll be okay. So, so I've been doing it that way, and I enjoy it. So that's how it came about.
That's a wonderful story. You know, in the church, we call all of that serendipity, the way things happen, we call that grace.
Okay.
A lot of grace there, I see. And so I'm just fascinated, both from the subject matter, the historical people in your book and the historians, and then this question for you: how do you, given all your busy schedule, all the things you have to do, how do you find the time to do all the reading and studying that you do? I know Walter Isaacson in the interview, he talked about, you know, he stays up half the night writing and loves to do that. Are you a night owl as well? When do you do all this work?
Walter is unusual. Some writers will say, I write 300 words a day and that's it. Some writers will say, I can write at 9 in the morning until midnight, till midday, and that's it. Some will say I start at night. In Walter's case, he writes late at night. I don't know how he does it, but he doesn't get tired, he does that. The time management is an issue, but I think it's a courtesy to somebody when you interview them about the book to actually read the books. I always read the books. And it kind of forces me to read the books. If I wasn't interviewing the people, I might not read the books, so it kind of forces me to read them. Unfortunately, it seems that writers of history books today are getting paid by the word. And so, you know, I just read Jill Lepore's 900-page book on United States history. It's very good. I'm now reading the David Blight's 800-page book on Frederick Douglass. And it seems like all these books, you know, in the old days, Charles Dickens got paid by the word. And sometimes I think that maybe some of these authors are getting paid by the word. It's hard, but I try to read it. Planes like tonight, after tonight, I'm going to fly to California tonight, and I've got 5 hours to read a book.
Are you a fast reader? Are you a fast reader?
I wouldn't say I'm a speed reader, but I put it this way. When I'm reading history books, or I read generally history books, biography books, business books, and political books on politics, I can read that pretty quickly because I know the area pretty well. If I had to read a physics textbook or a chemistry textbook or a theology textbook, I think it'd be, you know, I wouldn't be reading so quickly.
Now, as you mentioned, you're from Baltimore. My mother grew up in Baltimore. She always called it Balmer.
Well, you're correct. Baltimore has a distinctive accent, and when I went to Duke, I got in college in the South, people with that Southern accent there, they made fun of my accent. And so I had to change, I had to learn how to get rid of saying Baltimore or cement or Manhattan or all these other words. They just pronounce things differently, but it took me a while to kind of get, you know, change the accent a little bit. I still have a bit of it.
Are you a Ravens fan? Did you have any money on the game?
Well, I'm a Baltimore Colts fan. Unfortunately, they're not there anymore.
Me too.
And I was a Baltimore Orioles fan. Unfortunately, they're not there anymore either. But hope springs eternal that maybe, maybe something good will happen there.
You know, you mentioned your Patriotic Philanthropy, and it's amazing to me the number of documents that you have purchased and made available to the public. You know, everything from the Magna Carta to the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, Emancipation Proclamation, you name it. There's so many different documents, as well as all the work that you've done at Monticello and Montpelier and Mount Vernon. You mentioned this a little bit, but say a little bit more about really what continues to motivate you in this work?
Okay. So if you come from very modest circumstances, you say, how did somebody with my last name, Rockefeller or Rubenstein, either one, how did somebody with this last name, parents very modest, education and so forth, though I would say my parents, while they were modestly educated, they gave me the most important thing you can give to children, which is, I would say, unconditional love. And as all of you probably know, the hardest thing to do in life is raising children. Everything else pales by comparison. And Jackie Kennedy once famously said, if you mess up raising your children, nothing else in life really matters. And maybe she was right. And, my parents, were modest in their ambitions for me, but I got lucky in life and so forth. So I want to give back to this country. I mean, I'm not sure if I live in another country, whether I would have been fortunate enough to get where I am now. It was this country that made it possible for me to do that. So I'm trying to give back to the country. And I like to remind people that everybody can give back to the country in some ways. We all can give back to our schools and our universities and our libraries and hospitals, but we've all been fortunate to be Americans, and America has lots of needs, and again, you can help with your time, your energy, your ideas. Just do something to give back. And I just always reminded of a story I read by it was in the Stockholm newspapers. Stockholm, it happened in 1880s, I think it was, where Alfred Nobel was sitting down at the breakfast table, and he was reading the obituary section of the newspaper, and he read his own obituary. He read, "Alfred Nobel has died, the merchant of death is gone, thank God he's no longer with us." He was the inventor of dynamite. And he said, "Hey, I'm not dead. How did they write this?" Well, it turns out his younger brother had died the previous day. The newspapers got it wrong, that version of fake news, you might say. And so he said, "I've got to change my life." And so I ask people all the time, if you were going to write your own obituary today, and it was going to be published tomorrow, would you be happy with it? And if you're not going to be happy with it, do something about it. And if you think you've got a long time to go, you've got plenty of time to do something about it. So I try to remind people that in the end, if you try to do something to help other people or help your country, there's a selfish benefit to it. Number one, happy people who give their time, their energy, and ideas to other people are happy. Happy people live longer. David Rockefeller lived to over 100. He was a very generous person. Grumpy people don't live as long. So if you want to just be selfish about it, do something to help other people, and you'll be happy about it, and you'll live longer. Nobody's ever given food to somebody at a food kitchen and say, "I hate myself for feeding people in a food kitchen." Nobody's ever given scholarship to poor people and say, "I hate myself for doing that." You feel better about yourself, and you have a chance of living longer. And if that's not enough, I think there's a special place in heaven reserved for those people. Now, people might say, "How can I know that?" And maybe even you don't know that. But why would you want to take a chance that I'm wrong? I could be right. So I guess to answer your question, I feel very fortunate to come from very modest circumstances to be able to have the life I've led, and I want to give back to society, but also I want to remind people that they can do the same thing. So people ask me from time to time, "Well, why do you put your name on some of these things that you've done?" Well, to some extent, if somebody says, "Well, this guy came from nothing really, and look what he did, maybe I can do the same thing." It's designed to inspire people a bit to maybe try to do the same kind of thing.
Next time we get you back here, given what you just said, I'm going to put you up there. Let you give a sermon up there next time. That was quite something.
I don't. How many sermons have been given by Rubensteins here? I don't know.
Yeah.
But,
well, we are very fond of a Jewish guy around here.
All right. Okay. Well. Jesus started out as he was Jewish, right?
That's right, exactly right.
Right, okay.
So as a clergyman, I am fascinated by your purchase of a book of Psalms, the 1640 Bay Psalm book. It's, I think you hold the Guinness Book of World Records for the most expensive book ever purchased. Why that book?
Yeah, let me explain what happened.
We love the Psalms around here, but not that much.
Okay, let me explain what this is about. When this country was started, it was really started, at least in the Massachusetts part of it, started by pilgrims coming over. And the pilgrims were coming for religious freedom. And so, but when they kind of came over here, they brought over the Anglican prayer books. And so they're worshiping Anglican prayer books, even though they wanted to be not Anglicans. So they
Unfortunately,
yeah. Okay, so they said, we have to, why are we worshiping the Anglican prayer books when we're really not Anglicans? We escaped the Anglican Church. So eventually they said, we have to have a printing press, we have to have our own prayer book. So they eventually sent over for a printing press. It was sent over, and the man who brought it over died en route, and the printing press came, his wife inherited it, and she ultimately let it be used for the first prayer book in this country, but also the first book print in this country. I think it was 1635. And what it was the religious people among the Puritans, what they did is they went back to the original Hebrew and Greek versions of the Bible, and they translated again, and they figured the prayers they wanted. So they then printed up about 1,500 copies of this book. And it was used as print. It had a lot of typos. It was poorly printed. Wasn't well done. But it was the first book printed in this country. There are now only 7 of them left. And so one church in the Boston church had 2 of them, and their church needed a lot of money. So they decided with controversy that they would put one up for sale. And so I bought it, and it did pay a high price for it, the highest price ever paid for a book. And the woman was quoted, who was in charge of selling it for the church. She said, "We never thought we'd get 1/3 of this. I can't believe anybody paid this much." It didn't make me feel good I paid that much, but I did pay it. And so now that book goes around and it's on display. And I have bought a lot of other rare Bibles, which I've displayed elsewhere. I have the first Bible ever printed, not prayer book. The first Bible ever printed in this country was actually printed in the Algonquin language, because the man who put it together was trying to convince the Algonquin Indians to become Christian. They didn't have a written language, but he learned their oral language. He made a written language out of it, and he then put a Bible together to convince them to become Christian. It didn't work. But I have the first Bible printed, the first English Bible, the first Hebrew Bible, first Catholic Bible. I put them all on display at the New York Historical Society, and I think they're going to be displayed soon in Palm Beach or somewhere in Florida as well. So I have a lot of historic Bibles, but the prayer book is the most valuable book right now in America.
So when you talk about the Congressional Dialogue Series, you talked a little bit about how it came about. Do you think it's accomplishing what you like it to accomplish? Do you think it's moving more of the members of Congress to take their history more seriously?
Let me put it this way. During the Civil War, if you were a Confederate soldier or you're a Union soldier and you were on the grounds of Mount Vernon, which was considered holy ground, you were not to fight with each other. You put your arms down and you just talked to each other. There was no fighting there. So the same thing is true at the Library of Congress when we have these things. The Democrats and Republicans are not fighting with each other. They're joking. They're sitting down with each other. It's just that when they leave, we go back to, what we have now. The era of good feelings, I cannot say has broken out. On the other hand, members of Congress tell me consistently, this is the most interesting thing they're doing in Congress. Now that makes me feel a little nervous here. The most interesting thing is they're coming to a dinner. It's nice food and so forth, but to be honest, I guess I would say it hasn't changed the atmosphere completely, but I think people urge me to continue it. We've done, as I think, about 50 of them, and we have another program going forward this year, and so we do it about once a month, and I won't say it's changed Washington dramatically, but I don't think it's hurt anything.
I think it's a wonderful thing that you're doing. You talked about the lack of knowledge of civics in our country, and how that has fallen by the wayside. What do you think the best thing to do about that is? Is it just a matter of reinstating it within our public schools? What do you think about the idea that some people are floating about 2 years of mandatory public service for our young people before they head into college, something like that?
Even 1 year would be
even 1 year, yes.
Plus, what happened is this. In 1957, some of you may be old enough to remember this. I know I am. Sputnik was launched. Sputnik was about the size of a basketball. It was tiny. But it scared Americans to death because we thought the Soviets were way ahead of us, and they were a little bit in technology. So we said, forget English, forget history, forget all those subjects, learn science. And we began to do that, and we caught up and passed the Soviets. And then in more recent years, there's been a concern that the Chinese are taking over. So there's a concern that if you don't have a kind of a STEM background, you won't get a job, you won't be able to get a job that's useful, you won't be able to compete with the Chinese and so forth. So we have a focus on science, technology, engineering, and math. Nothing wrong with that. But what's happened is people now are afraid of majoring in history. Only 2% of the males in college these days major in history, and only 1% of the females major in history. And history majors are going down dramatically because people are afraid you won't get a job at Goldman Sachs or someplace like that if you major in history. The truth is, if you look at the majors, a lot of the big people leading major companies, they actually major in social sciences, but it's hard to convince young people who are under pressure to get a job right out of college that they need to major in history, and it's going to help them. The key thing about history is this. There's a famous Harvard historian, George Santayana, who said, those people who don't remember history are condemned to relive it, which means to say, we're going to make the same mistakes over and over again. So how can you solve this problem? Well, we should restore civics in the junior high school curricula we have, which a lot of junior highs have gotten rid of civics, and put history back in American history in schools. Right now, you can graduate from virtually any college in the United States without having to take an American history course. And from 80% of the colleges in this country, if you major in history, you don't have to take an American history course as a history major. So people just don't know many things. Recently, I gave you some of the statistics, but it turned out that more high school sophomores can name the Three Stooges' first names than the first names of many founding fathers. 25% of Americans, when surveyed, thought that George Washington, that George Washington crossed the Rhine River during the Revolutionary War and not the Delaware River. And so you just, it's hard to believe these things. So I don't have an easy answer, but progress is being made. And the one person who was helping was, and is Sandra Day O'Connor. She started a project called Civics, which helps have video games and so forth for junior high school students and others, and to learn more about civics. But it's a gigantic opportunity there.
What do you think about a year of national service for our young people? Do you think that'd be a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, I think a year of national service would be a good thing if we could figure out, A, how to pay for it, and whether we could figure out a way so people couldn't figure out how to get out of it. But some countries, they take it very religiously. I mean, Israel, for example, you have to serve 2 years in the military, and nobody gets out of it. You really have to serve. And in some other countries, they have the similar thing. Singapore has the same kind of thing. So I think it will be a good idea, but I think it's counter to our current culture, and I don't think Congress is likely to impose it. Yeah, and it would only happen in some kind of emergency situation. I don't really think that it will happen.
I agree. I think you're right, unfortunately. But let's jump into the book a little bit. Out of all the conversations in the book, which one perhaps surprised you or sticks with you the most? I don't want to say which one is your favorite. But
right. Well, it's hard to say. It's like, which of your children do you like the most?
Yeah, of course.
But I would say, let me talk for a moment about George Washington. You think about it, George Washington did not want to be the general in the Revolutionary War, and he was selected because we didn't have a lot of other people who were competent enough to do that. He didn't want to preside over the Constitutional Convention, but nobody else really could do so. And he certainly didn't want to be President of the United States, but he decided to do so. In each case, he was willing to walk away from power. Most generals, when they won a war, they would become Napoleon, or they would become the head of the country. When George Washington laid down his sword in New York and went back to Mount Vernon after winning the Revolutionary War, King George said, if that's true, that he's giving up power, he's the greatest man on the face of the planet. And the truth was, Washington didn't really want to have all of that power. He wanted to go back to Mount Vernon. Interestingly, people forget how he died. It's a kind of sad situation. He didn't really want to be president because no male member of his family had ever lived past the age of 50. So when the opportunity to become president arose, he was already 57. So he said, nobody, male members live this long, so maybe I'm not a good candidate. But he did it. And after a couple months, he was so frustrated with Congress, he was prepared to quit. But they persuaded him to stay. And interestingly, in those days, how things got done, he didn't like to write letters that much. He had other people help him do it. As we all know, Alexander Hamilton wrote a number of things for him. But what happened in those days, very often, James Madison, who was in the House of Representatives, he would write a letter to President Washington for the House. He would then write Washington's response himself, and then he would write the House's response to Washington. So anyway, Washington retired at the age of 57, goes back to Mount Vernon, rides around the plantation, gives advice, and every night people wanted to come there and pay homage to him, and he would have dinner with them every night, even if he didn't know these people. One time he comes back, it was raining and sleeting that day, he comes back dripping wet, and he didn't want to disturb the people who were there by saying, let me change, I'll be back in 45 minutes or so. He sat down kind of wet, maybe not the smartest thing to do. That night, the epiglottis in the back of his throat is swollen up, can't breathe, brings a doctor in. Doctor says tracheotomy won't work. But what will work is letting the blood out of your bad blood out, and will cut your veins, and that will help you. That doesn't work. It's not a good idea. So he died of a shock. When they opened his will, it turned out there were two very interesting things. One was, he said, I want all of my slaves to be freed upon the death of my wife. Now, no other founding father actually had ever freed their slaves, but he was the first one who did so, and the only one who ever did so, but upon the death of his wife. So how would you like to be Martha Washington, sitting there knowing that all the slaves know that as soon as she dies, they will be freed. So she freed him quicker. He also said, don't bury me for 2 days. Why would that be? Is that a religious thing? No, it turned out he was afraid of being buried alive. A lot of the doctors were very bad in those days. They put people in coffins when they weren't dead. So that's when they put bells in the coffins, and you were supposed to ring it if you were still alive before you got in the ground. And that's where the phrase dead ringer comes from.
And they actually would make those bells above ground as well, with a string that would run through the ground into the casket.
You're right. Well, the doctors weren't good, and hopefully they're better today. Let me talk about Thomas Jefferson for a moment. Thomas Jefferson, two things that I've always wondered about Thomas Jefferson. How could a man who had 200 slaves and took 2 slaves with him to Philadelphia write that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal? How did he do that? Well, he either thought in some spiritual sense people were created equal, but they couldn't live together. Maybe that's what he meant. Or he may have meant all white men are equal, but he never actually said. He lived exactly 50 years after July the 4th. He and John Adams died exactly the same day in 1826, 50 years the day of the Declaration of Independence. And by the way, when we voted to be free of England in July the 2nd, 1776, John Adams wrote to Abigail Adams and said, this will be the most famous day in the history of our country. We'll have fireworks forever from now on July the 2nd. Well, why do we celebrate July the 4th and not July the 2nd? Well, when July the 2nd, 1777 came around, the Continental Congress was meeting, they forgot. So they said, uh-oh, we forgot. Let's celebrate. It took them a day to get organized, so July the 4th they celebrated it. And John Adams was mad ever since because Thomas Jefferson was associated with the Declaration of Independence and John Adams with the decision to break away. So the other question with Thomas Jefferson has always been, he's a brilliant man and so forth. He didn't like to speak publicly. He only gave one speech as President of the United States. What was the nature of his relationship with Sally Hemings? So here's what happened. Thomas Jefferson, his wife is on her deathbed. She says, I had a stepmother. Please do not get married again. I don't want our 2 daughters to have a stepmother. Well, what's a man supposed to say on his wife's deathbed? He said, okay, I'll never get married again. He was 39. He didn't say he would be celibate, but he said he would never get married again. So he goes over to France as ambassador with his older daughter, and then his younger daughter is too young to take over. When she's old enough, at the age of 9, she's brought over, but even at the age of 9, she couldn't go by herself, so they had a slave bring her over. The slave who brought her over was Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was 16 years old then. Thomas Jefferson saw her, and what did he see? Well, he saw his wife, because his wife Martha's father was John Wares, but John Wares was a slave owner. He had impregnated one of his slaves, and the result was Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was 7/8 white, so he saw a 16-year-old who he imagined was like his 16-year-old wife, and he kind of, that's one explanation, he probably fell in love with her. And then he said, he impregnated her, and he said, you come back with me to Virginia, and I will free all of our slaves, our children who are slaves, upon my death, which he did. He didn't free her. And people often say, was it rape? Was it non-consensual? Nobody really knows. At 16 when he first impregnated her, 16 was not considered unusual. The age of consent in Virginia then was 12, increased from 10. So Thomas Jefferson, a brilliant man, but he never actually denied or he never denied that he had this relationship. It was public knowledge then. But now the DNA evidence is so overwhelming that it's clear that these children were his children.
You know, the original sin of slavery has been America's original sin, and the thing we still grapple with so much. Its tentacles are so long-lasting in this country. And how do you think the study of history can be helpful in helping us to move more towards racial reconciliation, racial justice in this country, especially in these explosive days in which we live?
Our country had a birth defect, which was slavery. The South, and to some extent the North, but the South particularly, was dependent on it. We would not have had a constitution if we had tried to outlaw slavery. We wouldn't have had a Declaration of Independence if we tried to outlaw it or said something about it. And the British made fun of us. They said, how can you say all men are created equal when you've got these slaves? And it's a unusual situation the Founding Fathers thought it would die out to some extent, but it didn't. And then the Civil War was the inevitable result. And then we had Jim Crow laws and all the other problems we've had since then. I don't know that the study of history will solve that problem, but I do think that the study of history can show you how terrible the situation was and how we've evolved, but still we've got a long way to go. And Thomas Jefferson recognized that slavery was terrible, but he politically he didn't think he could get rid of it, so he kind of abandoned the effort of trying to get rid of slavery. And even Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, he was no abolitionist. When he was inaugurated, in his first inauguration, he said, "I support the 13th Amendment." But that 13th Amendment was the one that reaffirmed that slavery was part of the law of the land. It was only later when he thought that the only way to win the war was to have an Emancipation Proclamation, free the slaves, weaken the Southern war machine, and then get a lot of slaves to work in the Northern Army, and that's what happened. But he was not an abolitionist at the beginning. I think the racial situation in the United States still has lots of challenges and lots of problems, and I think it all goes back to what happened 400 years ago when slavery started in this country.
It does. Original sin of our country. So out of all the figures in your book, you asked this of the historians you interviewed, out of all the figures in your book, who would you like to have dinner with, and what would you most want to ask them?
Well, they're all interesting. I mean, George Washington, I'd like to have dinner with him and say, what about those teeth? And yet he didn't really have wooden teeth. They were human teeth, but he only had one real tooth, and he held them together. Abraham Lincoln, I think, was by far our greatest president. He held the country together. It wasn't self-evident to me that had I been elected president in 1860 and the South said I was going to secede from the Union, I would have said, okay, go away, I'll just keep my country that I have. Because I don't think most people would have fought as hard as he did to keep the Union together, and that was what he gave his life for in the end. And Lincoln also was, while not well educated, was brilliant in terms of his writing abilities and his ability to kind of understand how to deal with people and be a leader. He would probably be our greatest president and the most interesting person to probably talk to.
Who do you think the greatest intellect was?
The greatest?
Intellect. Who do you think the greatest mental capacity, just the most brilliant of the figures in your book?
In the book?
Yeah.
Well, if you ask, I would say probably Benjamin Franklin was a genius. He was brilliant. I mean, the things he invented, bifocals and discovered, in fact, electricity and the lightning rod and so many things he did. He was uneducated as well, but brilliant. I think Thomas Jefferson was brilliant in many ways, a real Renaissance man, as you would say. Clearly a brilliant person.
When you're during your time in the Carter White House, I noticed that President Carter's biography of him was not part of the book. But what do you think President Carter's greatest legacy is or should be?
Well, it won't be hiring me, I'm sure, but it's a sad situation in this respect. My former boss, Stuart Eisenhower, has written a terrific book, 930 pages, on the White House years of Jimmy Carter. And he points out how many things actually got done in those 4 years, even though we kind of think that Carter was a hapless president and not consequential. So many things got done compared to what you get done today in a 4-year period of time. However, for better or worse, Carter will be known as our most productive and maybe influential former president, because he was president for 4 years, but he's been a former president for 40 years. And those 40 years, he helped eliminate guinea worm, river blindness, did a lot of the election monitoring around the world, written about 30 books. It's an incredible, productive person and a real Renaissance man. But unfortunately, history will probably not regard his presidency as successful as his ex-presidency.
Yeah, well said. One of my favorite quotes from your book is a quote by Taylor Branch in talking about Martin Luther King.
Right.
And he says, King was the most effective public voice. He consistently put one foot in the scriptures and one foot in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence in a balanced way that invited people to understand the mission of equal citizenship, either in secular terms or spiritual terms. They could take their choice. He didn't try to subdue one with the other.
So, Taylor Branch devoted 24 years of his life to writing these 3 volumes on the civil rights and really Martin Luther King. It's an incredible effort, not matched by anybody except Robert Caro's now 45-year effort to write the definitive biography of Lyndon Johnson. I hope he finishes it sometime soon. But back to Martin Luther King for a moment. Some of you may not remember the speech. I don't know if any of you remember the March on Washington in 1963. It was a complicated thing. The President of the United States, John Kennedy, was completely against that march. People thought it'd be violent. Schools were closed, stores were closed because everybody thought there'd be violence. Turned out there was no violence, but people were convinced there'd be violence. The civil rights leaders were very jealous of Martin Luther King because he was a better speaker than they were. And so they arranged for him to be the last speaker that day because nobody wanted to follow him. And also, they all wanted to be in the evening news, and they thought that he would probably speak by the time the last speaker wouldn't be on the evening news. So he actually spoke at the end. He had stayed up most of the night before with his speechwriter writing that speech. And the speech was written. And as he was giving the speech, the last speech of the day, behind him was Mahalia Jackson. And she kept saying to him, "Martin, tell him about the dream, the dream." And he departed from the speech, and he then just started giving this speech about "I have a dream." Now, for whites who had not heard that before, it was mesmerizing. And actually, for blacks who hadn't heard it, was mesmerizing. But many people who had been with him for weeks in churches had heard that speech, many, many times. But if you hadn't heard it before, it was quite mesmerizing. He captured the audience a bit, and after it was over, President Kennedy actually invited him and the other leaders to the White House, and President Kennedy greeted him and said, "I have a dream." He knew a good speech when he saw one. Actually, the speech didn't get that much coverage the next day in the New York Times. It wasn't that big a deal. It really became more famous when Martin Luther King was assassinated, because it was played over and over again on television. It became the symbol of him to some extent. But the speech itself, while a great speech, didn't get as much attention then as it has subsequently. Let me just mention one other person, which is Charles Lindbergh is in the book. Charles Lindbergh was the most famous man on the history of the earth at the time that he did landed. Now, with no disrespect to Jesus or Prophet Muhammad, when they were around, the world wasn't linked electronically. So if Jesus was doing something in Bethlehem, they didn't know about it in Beijing. So as soon as Lindbergh landed in Le Bourget Field, everybody, because the world was linked electronically for the first time, then everybody knew about it and everybody was happy. And here's a man who had flown 33 and a half hours. You'd say, what's the big deal? 33 and a half hours. Others had tried, had killed themselves doing so. He did that, and it was something that people thought was greater than going to the moon. It was an incredible achievement. He became the most famous man and lived a long life trying to get away from this publicity.
First global superstar.
He was. First global superstar. Everyone loved him. He tried for much of his life to get away from that and had tragedy when his first child was kidnapped and killed. So Scott Berg, a brilliant writer, spent 10 years of his life researching the papers. He had access to the family's papers. He researched everything. It's the definitive biography of him, and it won the Pulitzer Prize in 1999. But then he got a letter when the book came out and won the Pulitzer Prize, and the letter said, well, your book isn't really that good because you haven't had all the facts in there. You should meet with me, and I'll tell you what the real facts are. You get a lot of cranks sometimes send you crazy letters, but he was intrigued, so he met with a person. And the person said, well, here's what you got wrong. I am one of the 7 illegitimate children of Charles Lindbergh. He fathered 7 children from 3 German women, and you never wrote about it. Why don't you put us in your book? And he was stunned that he had spent 10 years of his life, and Lindbergh had kept this from his wife and his 4 children in the United States, that he had these 7 other children, and 2 of the women he had affairs with were sisters, and they didn't know they were each having affairs with Lindbergh. Anyway, I guess he could compartmentalize pretty well.
It's good when you can travel between continents by yourself, I guess. So back to the question about the Martin Luther King. So this cathedral has, as an important piece of its strategic work, doing just what we're doing tonight, which is convening people together for what we think and hope to be our important conversations with important folks who have something to say. And if you look at Branch's quote about religious leaders or religious institutions with 1 foot in the Declaration or the Constitution and 1 foot in the Bible, right, do you think there's room in our culture today for that sort of religious leadership or religious involvement in a positive way in our culture?
Well, if I said no in this place, I'm not sure I would.
No lightning, I don't think.
Yeah,
no.
Lightning, I don't know. I would say, of course.
Right.
But obviously, in the civil rights era, the church leaders from all denominations played major roles in the civil rights effort. In the anti-war effort of the Vietnam era, a lot of the church leaders played major roles in that effort. I'd say that you don't see the same passion by religious leaders today is united in terms of leading on certain social causes. I'm sure there's some, but nothing comparable to the civil rights leadership and nothing comparable to what you saw in the anti-war effort. But it is interesting that we came from Europe. Not all people, but many people in the United States came from Europe, or their descendants came from Europe. And Europe is now a place where religion is almost insignificant. You know, there's the Catholic Church, but the church attendance in Europe is so small compared to the United States. Church attendance in the United States is very high. And when you mention philanthropy, the United States is the most philanthropic country in the world. We give about 2.3 or 4% of our GDP every year to philanthropic causes, but 40% of that is for religious causes. So it's for the churches or other places of worship. So I think church leaders can do it, and religious leaders can do it. Billy Graham managed to kind of be a religious leader who played a role, but he wasn't that involved in social causes so much as other things. But I think there is a possibility, because many people do listen to their religious leaders. Obviously, there's been in some churches, there have been challenges to some of the leaders, but I think there is an opportunity. And in this institution, for example, whenever there is a crisis in Washington, there's a burial or people want to come together after some tragic event, where do they come? They come here. And it's a religious institution, and people feel, I guess, closer to their God here than they would anywhere else.
Well, we're honored to play that role. Thank you. And we want to move now to some questions from the audience. Okay. But before we do that, I want to ask you one last question. So what are you working on next? We got any new projects that you're taking on? Are you looking for another national monument to support? We've got one I can talk to you about.
Well, I get about $50 million of serious requests a month, and
A month. Wow.
And I can't do them all, but I have a couple things I am working on now, and time will tell. But maybe the most patriotic thing I could do for this country is to buy the Washington Redskins. That would be. So, but they're not available yet. But anyway, yes, this cathedral obviously is an important part of our nation's history and fabric, and you've done a wonderful job in bringing people together of all religions and all backgrounds. And I'm happy to be here in a perpendicular manner. Not horizontal, and I've spent a lot of time here, on the funerals of friends of mine and people I've admired. So I want to thank you for the role that the cathedral has played, and all of you who've come here tonight and have a chance to maybe not see the entire football game tonight, but I appreciate you all coming tonight, and appreciate the support of those who helped arrange this, Eric Motley, among others. Eric, thank you. And I want to thank all of you for coming, and I don't want to tell you that you will get to heaven more quickly if you read my book, but I think there's a pretty good chance of it. So I hope you'll read the book. And all the proceeds go to the Literacy Fund of the Library of Congress. And this is a serious problem we have in our country. We talk about income inequality, but think about this. 14% of the adults in this country are functionally illiterate. That means they can't read past the 4th grade level. If you can't read past the 4th grade level, you have no chance of rising up in our society and really reducing income inequality. So I've tried through the Library of Congress and other places to work with others who are working on literacy. It's a very serious problem. 80% of the people in our juvenile delinquency system are functionally illiterate, and 2/3 of the people in our federal prison system are functionally illiterate. So if you can't read, your chance of doing much productive is not so great. So the proceeds from this book will all go to that.
A really wonderful cause, and we hope we get you back here perpendicularly numerous times. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now we have a few minutes for questions. Michelle has the mic. Just raise your hand and she will come to you.
Thank you as a Duke Blue Devil for all you do for Duke and everything. The tallest building in the Federal Triangle is the Nancy Hanks Center. Could you please write more about the women in honor of Cookie Roberts passing? I mean, there's so many women, including all our first ladies, who've made history happen, and we as a nation don't do enough to celebrate the women who've made history.
Yes, it's a good point. It's called history, because men have been writing it. It should be called herstory. And Cokie Roberts, who was a friend of mine, and I was at a memorial event for her at the archives, she wrote three books, which I highly recommend, about the role that women played in our country at the beginning of the country and up through the Civil War. And they had enormous influence over their husbands and other things, but they didn't get the attention because in those days women couldn't vote, they couldn't hold office, and if they were married, they couldn't even own property in their own name. So Cokie did a great service, but obviously much more has to be done. And I am deeply involved in the Smithsonian's Women's History Initiative. As you may know, that history initiative is designed to ultimately build a women's museum, women's history museum in Washington, D.C. at some point, if possible. But in the meantime, celebrate what women's contributions are at all of the Smithsonian museums, among other things.
Mr. Rubenstein, you amaze everybody in every audience where you appear. Two quick questions that are related. What would you say to a younger David Rubenstein? What would your advice be to a younger David Rubenstein? And the second question is, what is your commitment to outreach for middle school and high school students to educate them and inspire them to study history?
The first question is what?
The first question, what would you say to a young David Rubenstein? What advice would you give?
Well, I mean, as a student, look, I'd say when I hire people, when I'm looking for certain skills, and I say to young students, these are the things that you should master. Learn how to write, and I don't mean a tweet. Learn how to write so you can actually persuade people of something. Learn how to talk orally so you can persuade people of something. Life is really about persuading people to do what you want. And think about it this way. Nobody can do anything by themselves. You have to persuade your partner, your spouse, your parent, your business colleague, whoever it might be, that they should do what you want. You're always persuading people, you should do this, you should do that. How do you persuade people? Well, you can persuade them by speaking well and being an effective speaker. You can be Martin Luther King, but if you can't be Martin Luther King, you can still be effective and learn how to speak. You learn how to write. Everybody can't be Ernest Hemingway, but you can learn how to write and influence people. But the most effective way to influence people, and I tell students this all the time, is to learn how to lead and persuade by example. When George Washington stayed in Valley Forge in 1777 with his troops, he could have stayed at the Ritz-Carlton down the street, but he didn't. He stayed with his troops because he wanted to lead by example, to be there when they were suffering, so he was showing that he was suffering as well. So I tell students all the time that you should persist, learn how to read, learn how to write, and learn how to enjoy learning. And when I give commencement speeches, I always remind students that now that you have a degree doesn't mean you can stop exercising the muscle that's your brain. 30% of people who graduate from college never read another book in their life. They think they're done with learning. It's a sad situation. You've got to keep exercising your brain if you're going to be anything or do anything productive with your life. And I like to remind people, this maybe applies to me, there are often people in life, some of you may be those people, and some of you may have children who win what I call the first third of life. They're the Rhodes Scholars, White House Fellows, Supreme Court clerks. They're the people that are student body presidents. They're anything you want. All of you, when you were in college or law school or high school or wherever you were in school, you always know these people that are the superstars. It actually turns out that rarely do people in the first third of life who are the winners turn out to be the winners in the second and third, because very often life is so easy for you if you're a Rhodes Scholar or White House clerk, Supreme Court clerk or White House Fellow, you don't work as hard. And I tell students, if you don't win the first third of life, you're going to be better off in some ways because you're going to have an incentive to work harder in the second and third of life where the benefits can be even greater. And in my case, I don't think I won the first third of life. There were people so much more talented than me, but I kept persisting. And I keep telling young students, persist, persist, persist. You know, if you're going to, failure is a good thing. Be happy to fail from time to time because you learn a lot more from failure than you learn from being successful all the time. And so always persist, don't take no for an answer. And I try to give that advice to students all the time, and I love speaking to students. And in the DC area, I have a program I've started with Economic Club Washington to give the best 2 students in DC high school every year scholarships to college, but it's a drop in the bucket. We need to do much more, and the DC public school system has lots of challenges, as we all know, but I think it's a good cause to get involved with.
Time for a couple more questions.
Thank you so much for all the information you've given us about history. As we all know, a lot of our students today spend so much time on the internet, learning via the internet. What are your thoughts about how that is going to have an impact on us versus people like me who spent most of my time in the libraries learning?
Well, I'm a big library person, as you may know, and I'm pretty involved with the Library of Congress, and I co-chair the National Book Festival, which I highly recommend to people here. We get 200,000 people coming every year for that, and I think the Library of Congress is a wonderful thing, led by Carla Hayden, who's done a spectacular job as the Library of Congress, the first woman to be Library of Congress, first African American to be Library of Congress, done a terrific job. And I like to go to libraries myself, and I still like to read books. I like to go to the bookstores and caress the books and write notes in the things. I don't really read the Kindles or those kind of things, but I realize I'm older. There's no doubt that you can learn enormous amounts over the internet, and it's like having the Encyclopedia Britannica equivalent at your fingertips. So when you pull out your iPhone, you can get any piece of information you want pretty much. So it makes it easier. I try to tell students that you shouldn't take the easy way of just getting things that quickly. You should, for example, some people think that when you send a tweet or an Instagram message of some type, that's communication, that's writing. And I try to tell people that you have to learn how to really write in a more meaningful way, but I may be losing the cause. And at my age, people are, people don't listen as much. I find that the older you get, people listen to you less, and particularly your children. So, I don't know how much influence I have, but, I do think that we need to worry that our libraries are ultimately going to go away if people aren't using them anymore, and everything's going to be on the internet. And the reason why everything shouldn't be on the internet in terms of getting your information is this. The reason why I try to restore some of these buildings or preserve these documents is not just for the sake of doing so, but the human brain has not yet evolved sufficiently, fortunately, such that if you go visit the Magna Carta and you see it in person, you're more likely to be prepared to read about it before you go there and read about it after you go there than if you just saw a computer slide of the Magna Carta. So if you go visit Monticello, once you actually go there, as opposed to just looking on the slides of the Monticello on the internet, you're going to learn more when you go there. You're going to learn more before. You're probably going to read more about it afterwards. So that's why I don't want everybody to get all their information just on the internet and just on computer slides, because you're not going to experience the pleasure of actually going to a place and learning things more deeply, in my view.
Thank you very much for everything you've said. I have a very simple sort of way down the ladder. I think that we are over 65, so far away from our children, our grandchildren, that someone like yourself, who instead of buying the Redskins, which I think is fun, would put something into our country really that you wouldn't be able to touch, or I might not be able to touch, but we can start handing down to even the 10-year-olds. For instance, our grandchildren, to teach the 2-year-olds. Because it seems to me that the 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds are running the country, and they're running our young mothers. I see a 10-year-old grandson telling his mother, "Oh no, I'm just wondering about, is this a possibility? Would that would this be a possibility of, a philanthropy?
Probability of what?
I'm not sure I followed the question.
Probability of,
Passing down these ideas
Well-
that you have and that you've contributed to young,
Well-
very young people.
you can only, you do what you can do, and you hope other people will pick up the mantle and follow at some point. Our grandchildren, respectively our grandchildren, I have two of them. One is like almost 2 and one is 2 months old. I'm not sure they're as likely to be doing the same things I'm going to do. As you all know, trying to persuade your children to do what you want them to do is very, very difficult and maybe impossible. Trying to persuade your grandchildren to do what you want them to do is, you can bribe them a little bit, but it's hard to really get them to do what you want. I don't know. I have to think about it.
One time for one.
2 quick ones?
Yeah, well, yes, 2 quick ones. And we have 2 quick ones, and we'll.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. You mentioned that slavery is the original sin of this country. What about Native Americans? What does history teach us about what happened to Native Americans?
What does history teach us about what happened to Native Americans? It's not just slavery.
Well, the Native Americans were treated, obviously extremely poorly in the same way, because while they weren't technically slaves, we, quote, our ancestors took their land, we killed them in many ways, we pushed them away, and we signed treaties with them which we didn't honor. So Native Americans have been treated extremely poorly, of course, and the results are today Native Americans are not as influential in this country as maybe they should be. And I mean Native Americans of all types, Indians, but Alaska Natives and so forth, and Hawaiian Natives and others are not as influential as they might have been had we not treated them so poorly. There's no doubt that the United States didn't honor its agreements, and had it done so, we might be better off, but the agreements weren't that fair to begin with. So I don't have an answer for it. I think learning more about what we did, it'd be a good idea, and there's some museums that in Washington and other books that are available that can talk about it, but that's not going to solve the original sin of the way they were treated. There's nothing I can do about that.
One last question.
What 1, 2, or 3 steps would you recommend taking to reduce either income inequality, educational inequality, or social inequality in this country?
If I had the answer to that, I'd be in Iowa tonight. And I don't think there's no great demand for me to be in Iowa. This is a very serious problem, and we have the greatest income inequality that we've had since the 1920s, and it's getting worse. But just as bad is something that's not mentioned called social mobility. Social mobility really means that somebody at the bottom feels they can, and they actually have a chance to rise to the top. I believed in the American dream when I was very young, and I believed that if I worked hard, I could get somewhere, and it worked out okay. But today, many people at the bottom part of our economic and social infrastructure and do not believe they can get to the top, and they've given up. And that's a big problem. And now, there's no easy answer, and if any politician had the answer, I'd be surprised why they don't come forward with it. The best thing that I can say is that education is the key to everybody's moving forward, and it was in my case getting an education, and so that's why I emphasize literacy. You have people who can't read, and where's Doro Bush? Where's Doro? Doro's mother really put me onto a lot of this. Doro's mother, Barbara Bush, had a Barbara Bush Literacy Foundation, which did a terrific job and is still doing a terrific job of helping with family reading and literacy. And it's an essential thing. And for example, I learned there that, and I have literacy awards that I give to the Library of Congress, but Barbara Bush Foundation's done much more. Children learn to read to a large extent from their parents, and their parents read to them. How many of you have, helped your children learn how to read by reading to them? So one program we honor at the Library of Congress is a program where when servicemen or women are overseas, they can't read to their children. But this literacy program kind of has a video set up so a father or mother can read to their young child even if they're deployed overseas, and that's a very good program, among other many good literacy programs. But I think literacy and getting people to be able to read is one of the keys that in my view, to eliminating, if not, well, ameliorating, if not eliminating, income inequality. We're not going to eliminate income inequality and make social mobility what it should be, but I think it's a major step forward. It would be a major step forward. So let me just conclude, but say I want to thank you for making this place available this evening. This is a very impressive and imposing place in which to speak. And obviously, you don't want to say anything inaccurate or a lie here because you never know if you could get struck down later or something like that. So it's a lot of pressure to always say the truth here. So I tried to say everything I could that was truthful, but maybe I exaggerated something here or there, and hopefully I can atone for that some other time. But this is an extraordinary organization and institution. I want to thank you for giving up some of your time tonight to be here. I hope you will enjoy the book, but I hope more importantly you will think about some of the message I was trying to convey, and most importantly, what you can do to help make this country a better place, and what small contribution you can make in any given area that would make this country the country that we all wanted it to be and our founding fathers originally hoped it would be, but it still hasn't yet lived up to that founding fathers' dream. Thank you very much.
Amen. Thank you, David.